has his own dreams for your life. And he's not there just to support your dreams, not to just facilitate it, not to just encourage you along in the dreams and agendas that you have made for your own life, but God has dreams for you too. That just like Elijah, you were God's imagination. Before your parents knew you, or your brother knew you, your friend, your spouse knew you, you were God's secret. He knew your personality. He knew your face when he constructed you, intricately woven within the depths of the womb. God knew you, and he saw you, and he thought about the dreams that he had for you. This is a question I have for you tonight. Very briefly, I'm going to ask this. Have you been dreaming without God? In all of the aspirations that you have set up, all the agendas and ambitions, have you been dreaming without God? You know, some of you may be there today and saying, you know what, Jason, that's true for the people on the worship team. I can see that God has great plans and dreams for them, but I'm not like them. And you use your own weakness and you think you're being humble, but what you're really doing is not doubting yourself, you doubt God. Because essentially what you're saying is, my weakness is so great that not even God's strength can be made perfect in it. Wow. That's what you are really saying in that situation. That's what I love about the Bible and Christianity. Because it does not hide the faults of its authors. In every other religion, the authors are venerated as gods. They are almost worshipped, they're revered. But the Bible is almost intentional about not keeping their mistakes a secret. The man that is known as to be a man after God's heart, David, is a murderer, a liar, an adulterer, and a thief. That's the man after God's heart. A man who wrote 13 books of the New Testament was a man who murdered people. He was almost like the Hitler of that day. Almost every person that God used to write this was tragically flawed. It's almost as if God was saying that even though they are weak, I am strong. And today I just want to look really briefly at a guy who God in his grace and his sovereignty just kind of picked, and he said, you, I want you. He picked a man who was totally and utterly and absolutely incapable, and through him he just displayed his power, his strength, and his might, and the world was never the same again because of what God had dreamt for this man. And you want to know something? You know, sometimes there's a tendency, because of all the encouragement that's there for the young people in the church, that if you're not active in the church or in ministry, either by your early 20s or even late 20s, then God doesn't have plans for you. But we're going to look at a man today that when he was 75 years old, God began to tell him about the dreams he had for him. We're just going to look really briefly at Genesis 15, 5 and 6. 8 through 12 and 17. I know I'm jumping around. I'm going to read fast though. Genesis 15, 5, 6, 8 through 12 and 17. It's a passage that we probably have read time and time again, but I'd like to revisit it. It says this, and he brought him outside and said, look towards the heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, so shall your descendants be. This is what it says about Abraham. It says, and he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And then Abraham asked a question. In verse 8, he says, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess this? He said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, and a female goat 3 years old, and a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And so Abraham brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. Verse 12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Last verse, verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. There are two things that I just want to say really quickly to you. That if there's anything you get from what I'm saying right now, is that you would see two things. That God is a God who dreams for you. And number two, that He is a God that is committed to you. You know, he took Abraham outside and he said, look at the stars. As I mentioned before, when I was in India, I'm telling you, I don't know if you know this, but India is not like Oklahoma, which is where I'm from. And you know, I would go outside in India and the sky would be gorgeous at night. I mean, there were times where I promise, it felt like you could see every single star in the universe. It was beautiful. And in Oklahoma, though, whenever I would go for walks at night, you know, I don't know, I do that sometimes, but I would just go for a walk whenever I would want to clear my head. And I would just go outside and I would walk, and I remember one time I was looking at the stars. And I was thinking about Abraham at that moment, and I started thinking, man, what would it have been like to be like Abraham? To walk outside and one day, God said, look at the stars. Try and count them if you can. That's what I'm going to make your descendants like. You 75-year-old man who is utterly and totally incapable of having children, I'm going to make your descendants like that. Something he would see every single day in and day out began to take a different kind of meaning. It started to look differently. And why I talk to you today about asking God, what are your dreams for me? And seeing what God sees. When you begin to see what God sees in your life, you begin to reinterpret the things that you normally would see every single day. You begin to see hope in hopelessness. You see beauty in ashes. You reinterpret the gifts and the talents that God has given you. You reinterpret your past, your present, and even your future. Everything begins to look different. Those stars in the night sky would always, from that moment on, take on a different meaning for Abraham, because he was able to connect with what God saw for his life. And some of you are sitting here and you've never asked a question, God, what are your dreams for me? And I'm asking you today, will you connect with what God sees for your life? This is why I feel like Job even says, with all that he had heard about God, with everything Job had heard about God, he finally had to come to a point where he said, God, my ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. My eyes have seen you. He's a God who dreams for you. I'm gonna move on, and I'm just gonna go right into the next point. He's a God who's committed to you. There's a funny story, and I'm not gonna say the name of the person or where they are from. I kind of got permission to share this